All right, so we've got Texas Tech hosting Kent State, and this line is absolutely fascinating from a value perspective. The Red Raiders open around -38, but here's where it gets interesting. The power rankings are telling a completely different story than what Vegas is putting out there. Kent State just broke a 21-game losing streak last week against Merrimack, and I mean, that's historically bad, right? But here's the thing. Sometimes when a team finally gets that monkey off their back, there's this psychological shift that happens. DeRillis Clark had a 100-yard kickoff return for the game winner, and Cade Wolford caught 2 touchdown passes for 109 yards. So they do have some explosive playmakers. Now, Texas Tech? Well, they absolutely demolished Arkansas Pine Bluff in their opener. But, and this is important, Baron Morton got hurt. Hyperextended knee in the second quarter after a low hit. Coach McGuire said the doctors felt good about it, but Morton was dealing before he went down. 16 of 18 for 201 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's elite quarterback play. Here's what's really intriguing about this spot, though. The power rankings have Texas Tech favored by over 45 points. But the betting market? They're only laying 38. That's a 7.3 discrepancy, which means the sharp money might be seeing something that the computers aren't picking up on. And look, I get it. Kent State traveling 1,242 miles to Lubbock, dealing with 3,200 feet of altitude. Those are real factors. But this feels like one of those spots where the public perception is so overwhelmingly negative on Kent State that it creates value. The weather's actually pretty good. 80 degrees at kickoff, winds from the south at 14 miles per hour. That's not going to impact much, maybe some deep balls and long field goals, but nothing major. What I keep coming back to is this. Texas Tech's backup quarterbacks look decent against Pine Bluff, but that's FCS competition. If Morton can't go, or if he's not 100%, this spread becomes a lot more manageable for Kent State. The Red Raiders also have below-average home field advantage, just 2.4 points compared to the typical 3. So when you factor in the massive travel distance working against Kent State, but then you've got this interim coaching bounce with Mark Carney, plus that confidence from finally winning a game. I'm not saying Kent State wins this game outright, but 38 points feels like a lot to give a team that just shows some real fight. The power rankings might be missing the human element here. Sometimes breaking a losing streak like that can completely transform a team's mentality, at least in the short term. The smart money seems to be on Kent State plus the points, and honestly, I can see why. So Iowa State is getting 2.5 points at home against Iowa in the Cyhawk rivalry, and honestly, that line feels light when you dig into what happened in Week 1. Let's start with Iowa's quarterback situation, because it's concerning. Mark Gronowski, the transfer from South Dakota State who was supposed to fix their passing woes, completed 8 of 15 passes for 44 yards. 44 yards. And then he left with cramping issues. I mean, this is a guy coming off shoulder surgery showing serious rust in his Iowa debut. If you're betting Iowa, you're basically hoping their ground game can carry them through a rivalry game on the road. Now, here's the thing. Iowa's rushing attack was absolutely dominant against Albany. 310 yards on the ground, completely controlled the line of scrimmage. Xavier Williams, a true freshman, steps in when Kamari Moulton gets hurt and rushes for 122 yards. First Iowa freshman to hit the century mark in his debut since 2005. That's impressive. But we're talking about FCS Albany here. Meanwhile, Iowa State, Rocco Becht just set a school record with 95% completion rate, 19 of 20 passes. The guy's now thrown touchdown passes in 20 consecutive games, 20 straight. And here's what's scary for Iowa's defense. Iowa State's tight ends absolutely destroyed South Dakota. 13 of 23 completions went to tight ends. Benjamin Brahmer caught 7 passes and 2 touchdowns. Gabe Burkle had 4 catches for 85 yards and a score. Think about this matchup problem. Iowa's coming off a game where their quarterback couldn't complete basic passes, and they're facing a team that just carved up opponents through the middle of the field with big tight ends. That's not a recipe for success. But wait, there's more. Kyle Conradi just nailed a 63-yard field goal for Iowa State. That's a school record, and the second longest in Big 12 history. So even if this game stays close, Iowa State has a weapon that can flip field position battles or steal points from anywhere past midfield. The power rankings actually favor Iowa slightly, but here's where it gets interesting. Iowa State's home field advantage is rated at 2.7. That's stronger than your typical home field boost and in a rivalry game. That atmosphere is going to be electric in Ames. Look, I get the narrative. Iowa's got that dominant ground game. Their defense is always solid, and they usually find ways to ugly up these rivalry games. But Iowa State just dropped 55 on South Dakota while showing they can beat you multiple ways. Rocco Beck through the air, Dylan Lee contributing 81 rushing yards, and special teams that can change field position in an instant. The weather's going to be perfect, 65 degrees, calm winds, no precipitation, so we can't blame conditions if Iowa's passing game continues to struggle. And that's the thing, against a ranked opponent that just showed they can execute at a high level, Iowa's going to need more than just Xavier Williams running behind a good offensive line. I'm seeing about 2 points of value on Iowa based on power rankings versus this spread, but honestly, when one team's quarterback sets school records for precision and the other's quarterback completed 8 passes for 44 yards before cramping up, sometimes the line tells you everything you need to know. This feels like Iowa State's game to lose at home. So Baylor just got absolutely gashed by Auburn's rushing attack to the tune of 307 yards, and now they've got to turn around and face a ranked SMU team that's coming off 2 pick sixes in their opener. The question is, can Dave Aranda's defense figure out how to tackle in 6 days? Look, the Bears' defensive performance against Auburn was legitimately concerning. Jackson Arnold, who's not exactly Lamar Jackson, ran for 137 yards because Baylor couldn't wrap up. When you're missing that many tackles against Auburn, what happens when you face SMU's speed? The Mustangs showed some serious defensive playmaking ability with those 2 defensive touchdowns, including that crazy 95-yard pick six by Ahmad Moses. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The market's got SMU laying around 3, maybe 3.5, and the power rankings are screaming that this line is off. We're talking about 4.8 points of value on the Mustangs, that's significant edge territory. Now, SMU does have some question marks. They lost Jordan Hudson, their top returning receiver, on literally the first play against East Texas A&M. Coach Rhett Lashley wasn't exactly thrilled with the offensive performance despite that 49-7 beatdown. Kevin Jennings looked decent, 22 of 30 for 260, but going from FCS competition to Baylor is going to be a massive step up. The situational stuff matters here too. Baylor's coming off normal rest while SMU had that short week, which usually favors the team with more prep time. But then you factor in SMU's exceptional home field advantage. We're talking 3.2 points, which is well above average, and suddenly that math starts working in the Mustangs' favor again. Sawyer Robertson threw for 419 yards against Auburn, so it's not like Baylor can't move the ball. The issue is, can they get stops? When you're going 3 for 6 on 4th downs because you don't trust your defense to get the ball back, that tells you everything about where this team's problems lie. The weather's going to be perfect. 90 degrees at kickoff, light winds, basically no precipitation. So we're looking at a clean game where execution's going to matter more than conditions. Here's my read. SMU's defensive opportunism, combined with Baylor's tackling issues, creates a really compelling spot for the Mustangs. Yeah, they've got some injury concerns and discipline problems. 8 penalties against an FCS team isn't great, but this power ranking edge is too big to ignore. When you're getting almost 5 points of value, plus that massive home field advantage, that's the kind of spot where sharp money usually shows up. The total's interesting too because both teams showed they can move the ball, but SMU's defense might create some short fields with turnovers, while Baylor's defense, well, they might not create many stops at all. So here's the fascinating thing about this Bowling Green-Cincinnati matchup. We've got 2 teams coming off completely different emotional trajectories, and that's where the betting angle gets really interesting. Eddie George just got his first FBS win as a head coach last week, right? And it wasn't just any win. Bowling Green opened with a 98-yard kickoff return touchdown. Cameron Petaway takes it to the house on the very first play. That's the 2nd straight year they've scored on the opening kickoff. I mean, that's not just luck. That's a legitimate special teams unit that can flip field position and momentum instantly. But here's what caught my eye in the data. Their defense was absolutely suffocating against Lafayette. 7 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, held them to just 177 total yards. Now, Lafayette's not exactly a powerhouse, but when you're looking at how a team might hang around as an underdog, defense travels. And if Bowling Green can generate that kind of pressure, Cincinnati's coming out that heartbreaker against Nebraska at Arrowhead, and the numbers tell a pretty ugly story for the first half. 81 total yards, 20 passing yards. Brendan Sorsby with just 69 yards passing for the entire game. But And this is crucial. They outscored Nebraska 14-7 in the second half. Sorsby ran for 96 yards and 2 touchdowns, so there's some dual threat ability there. The problem? Red zone execution. Cincinnati drove 75 yards in the final minutes to get within field goal range, and Sorsby throws a pick in the end zone. That's the kind of mistake that haunts you, especially when you're trying to establish momentum early in the season. Now, here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Cincinnati's power ranking puts them in the dominant team tier, but what does that actually mean when we're talking about a team that managed 20 passing yards and a half? The narrative says if both teams are motivated, the underdog's usually just trying to cover, but I'm not sure Cincinnati's offensive struggles support that dominant label right now. Home field advantage is supposedly worth 2.5 points, but remember, Cincinnati just played a home game where 95% of the crowd was rooting against them. So how much does that home field really mean for a team that's still trying to find its identity? Weather's perfect, 63 degrees, light winds from the northwest, no precipitation. So we're not getting any help from Mother Nature to slow things down or create chaos. Look, Bowling Green's got that explosive special teams element, a defense that can create negative plays, and Jackson Cleather just nailed a career-long 56-yarder, so they've got range in the kicking game. Cincinnati has more talent on paper, but they're coming off a game where they look completely out of sync for 30 minutes. The betting story here isn't just about power rankings or home field advantage. It's about which version of Cincinnati shows up. The team that managed 81 yards and a half, or the one that fought back and nearly tied it in the fourth quarter. Colorado's got some serious issues to work through after that Georgia Tech loss, and Delaware's rolling in here from 1,700 miles away, looking to make a statement in their second FBS game ever. Let's start with what jumped out from Colorado's opener. They gave up 320 rushing yards. 320, that's not a typo. Georgia Tech's quarterback Haynes King ran for 156 yards and 3 touchdowns by himself. When you're letting a quarterback put up those numbers on the ground, that's a red flag the size of the Rocky Mountains. Now, Deion Sanders is calling his team a work in progress, which, that's coach speak for we've got problems. They lost Travis Hunter to the NFL. Shedeur Sanders is gone, and they're trying to figure out their identity with Caden Salter under center. Salter looked decent in his debut. 159 passing, 43 rushing, 2 total touchdowns. But this offense is clearly still finding its rhythm. Here's where it gets interesting for bettors, though. Delaware comes in off a 35-17 win where they looked really sharp. Nick Minicucci was surgical, 28 of 36 for 251 yards and 3 passing touchdowns. Plus, he added 44 yards and a score on the ground. That's dual-threat production that could absolutely exploit Colorado's defensive struggles. And let's talk about that Delaware passing attack for a second. Jake Thaw caught 7 balls for 91 yards. Kyer Duplessis had 8 for 89 and a touchdown, including a 50-yard bomb that sealed the game. When you've got multiple weapons like that and you're facing a Colorado defense that just got torched, well, the math isn't complicated. But here's what's really intriguing. Delaware is getting 2.8 points of value based on the power rankings versus this spread. That's significant. Colorado's sitting at 5,400 feet elevation, which is always a factor, but Delaware just played through steady rain in their opener and still put up 35 points. These guys aren't going to be rattled by a little altitude. The situational stuff matters too. Delaware's had extra time to prepare while Colorado's on normal rest. Yeah, the Blue Hens are traveling over 1,500 miles, but they've got that new program energy, you know? Coach Ryan Carty is 22-1 in home openers, including his playing days, so this guy knows how to get teams ready for big spots. Colorado's home field advantage is worth 2.6 points, which is above average, but is that enough to cover up the defensive issues? When you're giving up over 7 yards per carry to Georgia Tech, and now you're facing a Delaware team that can hurt you both through the air and on the ground. Look, the weather's going to be perfect. 67 degrees at kickoff, winds around 8 miles per hour from the south-southeast. No excuses there. This comes down to execution and, honestly, which team wants it more. Delaware is trying to prove they belong at the FBS level. Colorado's trying to prove last week was just first-game rust. But when you dig into the numbers, when you look at how these teams actually played their first games, Delaware looked like the more complete team, and they're getting points on the road. Sometimes the obvious play is the right play, and sometimes a team that just gave up 320 rushing yards is going to have problems stopping anyone with the pulse. All right, so we've got Oregon hosting Oklahoma State, And this one's pretty straightforward on paper, but there's actually some interesting wrinkles here that make it worth digging into. Let's start with the obvious. Oregon just absolutely demolished Idaho State 59-13 in their opener. But here's what matters for bettors. New quarterback Dante Moore looked completely dialed in. 213 yards, 3 touchdowns, spread the ball to 10 different receivers. This wasn't some garbage time stat padding against scrubs either. Idaho State was the defending Big Sky champs who made the FCS title game. Oregon started fast, scored 63 seconds into the game, and never let up. That's the kind of ruthless execution you expect from a championship contender. Now, Oklahoma State, well, they've got some issues. Starting quarterback Haas Heine got hurt late in the first quarter against UT Martin with what looks like a lower body injury. Coach Gundy's giving us nothing on his status, which usually means it's not good news. Here's the problem. Heine was actually playing really well before he got hurt. 96 passing yards, 1 touchdown through the air, plus 27 rushing yards and a rushing score. The offense just looked different with backup Zane Flores under center. And speaking of their offense, the running game is a mess right now. 127 rushing yards on 42 carries against UT Martin? That's what, 3 yards per carry against an FCS team? Coach Gundy specifically called out his offensive line, said they didn't pave the way for transfer running back Khalib Hicks. That's not exactly confidence-inspiring when you're about to face a Oregon defense that's loaded with talent. The one bright spot for Oklahoma State? The defense looked legit after that first quarter. Shut out UT Martin the rest of the way. Linebacker Wendell Gregory had 3 sacks, and they came up with a huge red zone pick. If Heine can't go, they're going to need that defense to keep them in this thing. Now, let's talk numbers. The power rankings have this as a true mismatch. Oregon's in that top tier, Oklahoma State's sitting near the bottom of Power 4 teams. Oregon's got a strong home field advantage too. 2.8 points, which is higher than the usual home boost. When you factor that in, the Cowboys are actually getting slight value here, about 0.7 of a point of separation between what the numbers suggest and where the line's sitting. But here's the thing about that travel situation. Oklahoma State's coming from 1,475 miles away with a plus 2-hour time adjustment after an extra long week. Sometimes that helps teams get focused and prepared, but sometimes it just means rust and timing issues. Weather shouldn't be a factor. 66 degrees at kickoff, winds around 6 miles per hour from the west-southwest. Maybe makes deep balls and long kicks slightly trickier, but we're talking marginal impact at best. Look, if Heine's healthy, Oklahoma State's got enough talent to keep this from getting completely out of hand. Their defense showed they can make stops, and they've got some intriguing transfer pieces like receiver Terrell Davis, who has 75 yards on just 2 catches. But if they're rolling with Flores at quarterback behind that struggling offensive line, Oregon's gonna feast. The question isn't really whether Oregon wins. It's whether they can maintain that killer instinct for 4 quarters like they did against Idaho State. Missouri minus 3.5 against Kansas on Saturday night, and the market's telling us something interesting here. Both teams absolutely demolished their FCS opponents last week, but the underlying stories couldn't be more different. Let's start with Missouri, because this Bo Pribula situation is fascinating. Guy transfers in from Penn State, and in his first collegiate start, 23 of 28 for 283 yards passing, plus 65 rushing with 2 more touchdowns on the ground. That's not just settling in, that's making a statement. But here's where it gets really interesting for bettors. Sam Horn, who was supposed to be the competition for the starting job, he goes down with what looks like a serious knee injury on literally his first snap. So Missouri's depth chart just got real thin real quick. They've got true freshman Matt Zollers behind Pribula now, and while he looked decent in limited action, any hit to Pribula could change this whole season. Now Kansas, Jelon Daniels threw for 280 yards and 4 touchdowns, which sounds great on paper. But dig deeper, and there's some red flags here. Both of their turnovers came in the red zone, including a Daniels interception. Against Wagner, that's just sloppy. Against Missouri, that could be the game right there. And here's what really caught my attention. Kansas converted only 4 of 10 third downs against an FCS team. I mean, think about it. If you can't stay on the field consistently against Wagner, what happens when you're facing a Big 12 defense that actually has athletes? The power rankings are screaming Missouri here. We're talking about 4.1 points of value according to the computer models, which is, well, that's significant. Missouri's rated as the solidly stronger team, And Kansas would need something special: injuries, a major stylistic mismatch, or a perfect storm of factors to pull the upset. Weather's a non-factor. 69 degrees at kickoff, 2-mile-per-hour winds from the northeast, perfect conditions for whatever style of play you want to run. But here's the thing that's nagging at me. Missouri showed some discipline issues last week, 8 penalties for 70 yards, including 2 that extended drives. You can get away with that against South Dakota, but Kansas is going to make you pay for those mental mistakes. The offensive line play for both teams was dominant last week, but Missouri's more impressive when you consider they put up 560 total yards with multiple 99-yard touchdown drives. That suggests they've got the explosive play potential to break this game open. Kansas controlled the line of scrimmage too, outgaining Wagner 623 to 143. But again, it's Wagner. Missouri's defense actually forced turnovers and created big plays, like that 83-yard pick six from Dante McClellan. Look, Missouri gets the extra day of rest coming off their Thursday night game, which helps with preparation. Kansas had to wait until Saturday. Small edge, but in a rivalry game where emotions run high, every little advantage matters. The home field advantage at Missouri is only worth 2.4 points, which is below average. So we're not talking about some intimidating fortress here, but combined with their power ranking advantage, it's still enough to make them solid favorites. Here's my read. Missouri minus 3.5 feels right. Pribula's emergence gives them the quarterback play to control this game, and Kansas hasn't shown they can execute consistently in pressure situations. Those red zone turnovers and third down struggles, they're going to cost them against better competition. The question isn't whether Missouri wins, it's whether they cover that number. And with their offensive explosiveness and Kansas's execution issues, I think they get there. West Virginia heads to Athens with a fascinating contradiction on their hands. They just put up 625 yards of offense against Robert Morris. That's legitimately impressive production. But they also fumbled 5 times and lost 4 of them. I mean, that's not just sloppy. That's borderline catastrophic against better competition. The thing is, underneath all those turnovers, you can see Rich Rodriguez's system starting to click. Garrett Marchio completed 17 of 20 passes. Jaheim White looked like a legitimate number 1 back with 93 yards. And they're playing with that classic Rodriguez pace that can wear defenses down. But here's the reality. You can't give away 4 possessions and expect to cover spreads against MAC teams that actually have a pulse. Ohio's coming off something completely different. They just went toe-to-toe with Rutgers and lost 38-31, but Parker Navarro looked like a legitimate star in that game. 239 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 93 rushing yards, and another score. That's the kind of dual-threat production that can absolutely shred a West Virginia defense that's still figuring itself out under a new coordinator. The situational spot here is really interesting. Ohio's off a long week. They had extra time to prepare after that competitive loss to a Big Ten team. Meanwhile, West Virginia is on normal rest but dealing with the psychological hangover of nearly losing to an FCS school. Which mindset wins out? The team that almost got embarrassed, or the team that proved they can hang with Power 4 competition? From a systems perspective, this matchup has fireworks written all over it. Rodriguez wants to play fast and create big plays, but his team is still learning the system and making costly mistakes. Ohio's got Navarro, who can escape pressure and make plays with his legs. Exactly the kind of quarterback that can exploit a defense still gelling under new leadership. The weather's perfect, 58 degrees at kickoff, light winds from the west-northwest at 5 miles per hour. No excuses, no adjustments needed. Just pure football. Ohio's getting 2.7 points of home field advantage, which is above the typical MAC bump. That tells you something about their fan support and the atmosphere they can create in Athens. Against a West Virginia team that might be dealing with some confidence issues after those fumbling problems. Look, here's what I keep coming back to. West Virginia has more talent and a proven system, but they're a mess with the football right now. Ohio has a quarterback who can create magic, and they're playing at home off a moral victory. The Mountaineers should win this game, but the way they're turning the ball over, Navarro and Ohio might just have enough juice to keep this thing closer than the power rankings suggest. Utah just put on an absolute clinic against UCLA, and honestly, it wasn't even close. 492 total yards, 30 first downs, and they held the ball for 15 minutes longer than the Bruins. That's not just winning, that's complete domination. But here's what really caught my eye. The offensive coordinator change is already paying massive dividends. Jason Beck comes over from New Mexico, where the Lobos were 4th in the country in total offense, averaging 484 yards per game. And look, you don't just flip a switch and transform an offense overnight, but Utah looked like a completely different team than what we saw struggle last season. Devin Dampier, this guy's the real deal. 21 of 25 for 84% completion, 206 yards through the air, 2 touchdowns, and then he leads the team in rushing with 87 yards. That dual threat ability is exactly what this Utah offense was missing. When you've got a quarterback who can hurt you with his legs, it opens up everything else. The ground game was just brutal. 286 rushing yards compared to UCLA's 84. Multiple guys finding the end zone on the ground. Dampier, Wayshawn Parker, Smith Snowden, all punching it in. That's the kind of physical identity that wears teams down over 4 quarters. Now Cal Poly's coming to town Saturday, and look, this is one of those spots where the power rankings tell you everything you need to know. We're talking about an extreme mismatch here, but that's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. The line often gets inflated in these situations because of public perception, and efficiency metrics become less reliable when you're dealing with this kind of talent gap. Cal Poly's making a 610-mile trip, dealing with a 1-hour time adjustment, and they're going to be playing at over 4,600 feet of elevation. That's not insurmountable, but it's another layer of adversity stacked against them. The weather's actually going to be perfect. 62 degrees at kickoff, light winds around 4 miles per hour from the east-southeast, essentially dry conditions. So no excuses there, no equalizing factors. Utah's got this exceptional home field advantage worth 3.1 points according to the metrics, which just compounds their existing power ranking edge. But here's the thing with these massive mismatches. Sometimes the motivation factor becomes the wild card. Utah's coming off that statement win against UCLA. They're feeling good about themselves, and now they've got to get up for what should be a glorified scrimmage. The smart money might be looking at whether Utah can maintain that same intensity level, that same attention to detail they showed against the Bruins. Because when you've got Devin Dampier running Jason Beck's system with that kind of rushing attack behind him, this could get ugly fast if they stay focused. So, Army versus Kansas State. And honestly, this line tells a story that goes way deeper than just the spread. Army's coming off what might be the most embarrassing loss in recent memory, blowing a home game to an FCS opponent in double overtime. I mean, we're talking about the defending AAC champions losing their 9-game home winning streak to Tarleton State. That's not supposed to happen, you know? But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Army's quarterback, DeJuan Coleman, got hurt, with 57 seconds left in that disaster, and we still don't know his status. The guy had 229 total yards, 100 rushing, 129 passing, before going down. If he can't go, or if he's limited, that completely changes Army's offensive identity. And their kicking game? Brutal. Freshman Dawson Jones missed a 43-yarder at the end of regulation, then a 35-yarder in double overtime that would have won it. In a sport where field goals decide games, that's a massive red flag. Now flip over to Kansas State, and it's almost like looking in a mirror of dysfunction. They nearly lost to North Dakota, an FCS team, after blowing a 10-point fourth-quarter lead. Avery Johnson had to engineer an 81-yard touchdown drive with 42 seconds left just to avoid complete catastrophe. Think about that for a second. Both teams struggling against FCS competition in the same week, but Kansas State at least found a way to win, even if Johnson himself said they shouldn't be satisfied with how we played. The power rankings still have K-State in the dominant tier, which feels generous after what we saw. They're getting 3.1 for home field advantage, which compounds their existing edge. But are we looking at fool's gold here? From a situational standpoint, Army's traveling 1,200 miles after that emotional disaster. That's a lot of cross-country travel for a team that just had their confidence shattered. Meanwhile, K-State gets normal rest at home, but they're dealing with their own psychological baggage. The weather should be clean, 63 degrees, minimal wind impact, basically dry conditions, so no excuses there for either offense. Here's my read on this game. Army's ground attack, 280 yards on 66 carries against Tarleton. That's still their calling card. If Coleman's healthy, they can control tempo and keep this close. But Kansas State's defense, even struggling, should be a step up from what Army just faced. The real question is whether K-State learned anything from nearly losing to North Dakota. Because if they bring that same energy where they blow leads and struggle to finish, Well, Army knows how to grind games ugly. I'm not convinced either team deserves much respect right now, but sometimes that creates the best betting opportunities when the market hasn't fully adjusted to how bad both teams looked. So we've got UCF hosting North Carolina A&T, and look, this is one of those spots where the line tells you everything you need to know about how Vegas views this matchup. We're talking about an FCS program making a 522-mile trip to face a team that just had Scott Frost return to the sideline. Now here's what's interesting about UCF coming off that Jacksonville State game. Taven Jackson showed some serious poise in those final 2 minutes. I mean that 15-yard scramble on 3rd and 10, then hitting DJ Black for the game winner from 33 yards out. That's the kind of clutch factor you can't teach. But let's be real here. They also coughed up 3 fumbles against Jacksonville State and got outgained on the ground, 165 to 108. Against an FCS opponent, that's concerning. The turnover issue is what jumps out to me most. When you're fumbling the ball 3 times against a team you should be handling comfortably, that tells you something about focus and execution. And Miles Montgomery grinding out just 79 yards on 21 carries? 3.8 yards per carry against Jacksonville State suggests this ground game has some serious work to do. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. Power rankings show this as an extreme mismatch, which is exactly what you'd expect. The problem with these FBS versus FCS spots is that the efficiency metrics become, well, less reliable. You're dealing with such different levels of competition that the numbers can lie to you. What I do like about UCF is that defensive clutch factor we saw. That 4th down stop with 1:31 left, then Jaden Bellamy sealing it with the pick. That's the kind of situational execution that wins you games when things get tight. Though giving up 165 rushing yards to Jacksonville State, that's not exactly inspiring confidence in the run defense. The weather's going to be a factor here too. We're looking at 80 degrees at kickoff, but with that Florida humidity sitting around 79%, this is going to feel oppressive. High-tempo teams can really fade in the second half under these conditions, and fitness levels become huge. UCF's got that 2.8 home field advantage working for them, which is actually above average, and compounds their talent edge. North Carolina A&T is coming off normal rest, while UCF had the extra long week to prepare. Sometimes that extended prep time helps you clean up the fumbling issues, sometimes it just gives you more time to overthink things. With Frost back on the sideline for his second game, you've got to wonder if we see a more polished product or if those Jacksonville State struggles were more telling than we'd like to admit. The thing is, when you're looking at this extreme of a mismatch, the question isn't really who wins. It's whether UCF can cover what's likely going to be a massive number. And with those ball security issues still fresh, that's where this gets interesting for bettors. All right, so here's the thing about this Houston at Rice matchup. We've got 2 teams heading in completely opposite directions. And the narratives couldn't be more different. Sam Houston's sitting at 0-2, and honestly, they look lost. I mean, they're rotating quarterbacks like they're searching for answers that aren't there. Hunter Watson goes 11 for 22 for just 101 yards. Then Mabry Matauer comes in and completes 8 of 13 for 86. That's a combined 187 passing yards between 2 guys, and neither one's really grabbing hold of this offense. But here's what's interesting. They showed serious explosive potential in that 4th quarter against UNLV. Landon Brown rips off a 53-yard touchdown run. The Meta connects with Tim Burns Jr. for 59 yards and another score. That's 112 yards on just 2 plays out of their 332 total. So the talent's there. It's just inconsistent as hell. Rice, on the other hand, they just ground out an ugly 14-12 win over Louisiana, and you know what? Sometimes ugly wins tell you more about a team than pretty losses. Quentin Jackson rushed for 119 and a touchdown. Dalen Alexander added 74 more yards. They controlled that game on the ground with 193 rushing yards, and their defense came through when it mattered, stopping Louisiana on 4th and 2 with 6.5 minutes left. Now, Chase Jenkins only threw for 45 yards on 7 completions, which, look, that's concerning if you're thinking long-term. But for this matchup, against a Sam Houston defense that just let Anthony Calandria, a transfer quarterback in his debut, complete 19 of 23 for 249 yards, Rice might not need to throw much. The weather's going to be a factor here, too. 84 degrees at kickoff in Houston with 71% humidity. That's brutal. Both teams are going to feel it. But Sam Houston's been playing at a higher tempo, trying to make up for deficits. If they fall behind again and have to chase, those cramps could really hit in the second half. What's really telling is how these teams handle momentum swings. Sam Houston recovered an onside kick down 17, cut it to 38-21, had all the momentum in the world, and couldn't punch it in again. Meanwhile, Rice scored all 14 of their points in the first half against Louisiana and just held on. That's two completely different mindsets right there. The power rankings supposedly have Houston in the dominant team tier, but I'm not seeing it on the field. They're 0-2 with a rotating quarterback situation and defensive issues. Rice gets the standard 2.5 points for home field, and honestly, in this heat, at home, with a ground game that can control tempo, this feels like Rice can keep it close, maybe even steal one outright. Sam Houston's got the talent for big plays, but they can't seem to put it together for 4 quarters. Arizona State rolls into Starkville off a short week after that ugly but convincing 38-19 win over Northern Arizona. And look, when I say ugly, I mean it. 12 penalties for 93 yards, multiple touchdowns called back, and they converted just 2 of 10 third downs. But here's the thing. They still won by 19 points. That's either really encouraging depth and talent, or it's masking some serious execution issues that Mississippi State could exploit. Sam Leavitt looked electric when he wasn't getting flags thrown, racking up 330 total yards and 4 touchdowns. The kid can absolutely fly 73 rushing yards on top of 257 through the air, but those third down struggles? That's going to be a problem against a Mississippi State defense that, honestly, we don't know much about yet. Now, Mississippi State, they pulled off this incredible Jekyll and Hyde performance against Southern Miss. First half looked rough, but then, boom, they outgained them 199-25 in the third quarter alone and dropped 21 straight points. Blake Shapen looked solid in his return from that shoulder injury last season, 26 of 34 for 270 yards. The guy's been through hell and back, so you gotta respect the mental toughness. But here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Mississippi State had 2 touchdowns called back in that first half due to penalties. Sound familiar? Both teams are dealing with discipline issues, which means we could see a really sloppy game with lots of momentum swings. This situational stuff heavily favors the Bulldogs. Arizona State's traveling 1,334 miles on a short week, dealing with that 2-hour time difference. Meanwhile, Mississippi State gets their home opener after a normal week of prep. The power rankings say Arizona State should be the better team, but that below-average home field advantage of just 2.2 from Mississippi State tells us this venue isn't exactly Death Valley. Weather's going to be perfect, around 70 degrees at kickoff with light winds from the northeast. No excuses there. You know what's really intriguing me, though? Both quarterbacks showed they can create magic when things break down. Leave it with those scrambling abilities, Shapen with that veteran poise coming back from injury. But both teams are also dealing with penalty problems that cost them points. I'm thinking this game comes down to which team cleans up their act first. Arizona State has more talent, but they're in a tough spot situationally. Mississippi State desperately needs this home opener after that brutal 2-10 season. So Arizona's sitting pretty after that 5-turnover domination of Hawaii, and now they get Weber State coming to town fresh off getting absolutely steamrolled by James Madison. I mean, we're talking about a Weber State team that managed a whopping 148 total yards against JMU while giving up 458. That's not great. Look, the Wildcats, Arizona, not Weber State. They looked like a completely different team than last year's 4-8 disaster. New defensive coordinator Danny Gonzalez has these guys flying around, and that rushing attack? Quincy Craig averaged almost 18 yards per carry against Hawaii. 18! You don't see that very often, especially with a 54-yard touchdown run that just carved through the middle. But here's where it gets interesting from a betting perspective. We've got what power rankings suggest is an extreme mismatch, but, and this is crucial, efficiency metrics get wonky in these massive spread games. The public sees Arizona dominating Hawaii, they see Weber State getting boat raced by JMU, and boom, the line inflates beyond what it should be. Now, Weber State's got some serious issues to work through. Their offensive line couldn't protect anybody against James Madison, and when you're facing a defense that just forced 5 turnovers in their opener, that's a recipe for a very long afternoon. Plus, they had a punt block that went for 6 points. Special teams breakdowns like that can snowball fast. The situational stuff matters too. Weber State's making a 621-mile trip to Tucson. They're coming off a long week while Arizona's on normal rest. Arizona's home field advantage is only about 2 1/3 points, which is below average, but when you're already a massive favorite, that doesn't really matter. Weather's going to be perfect. 79 degrees at kickoff, basically no wind, dry conditions, so no excuses there for either team. Here's what I keep coming back to, though. Arizona's defense recorded 5 sacks and 10 tackles for loss against Hawaii, their first game with at least 5 sacks and 5 takeaways since 2016. That's not a fluke. That's Danny Gonzalez installing a system that actually works. And Noah Fafita showed he can hurt you with his legs too, not just his arm. The thing is, we know Arizona's schedule gets brutal after this. Kansas State and Iowa State are waiting, both ranked teams. So there's motivation to make a statement here, to build momentum before the real tests begin. For Weber State, honestly, this might just be about avoiding complete embarrassment. Their run defense got gashed, their offensive line couldn't block anybody, and now they're facing a team that's clicking on all cylinders. Sometimes in these spots, the underdog finds ways to stay competitive for a half, maybe catches a few breaks early. But when you're getting physically dominated in the trenches, that's tough to overcome on the road. The data tells a pretty clear story here. Arizona's firing on offense, their defense is creating chaos, and Weber State looked completely overmatched against a JMU team that's good but not elite. Sometimes the obvious play is the right play. So BYU just put up 69 points in a shutout, and now they're getting Stanford off a bye week. Look, I know what you're thinking. Portland State isn't exactly the SEC, but there's some real meat on this bone for Saturday. Let's start with the obvious. BYU's rushing attack put up 468 yards and nearly 10 yards per carry. 14 different guys touched the ball, and LJ Martin averaged over 16 yards per rush. That's not just beating up on cupcakes, that's systematic destruction. When your backup running backs are ripping off chunks like that, you got something special brewing. But here's what caught my eye. Bear Bachmeier, true freshman, making his first start, throws for 3 touchdowns and runs for 2 more in basically one half of work. 64% completion rate, looked completely comfortable out there. For a Stanford defense that's been, well, let's call it inconsistent, facing a mobile quarterback with this kind of ground support, that's a problem. Now Stanford's coming off a bye, so they've had 2 weeks to prepare. That usually helps the underdog, right? Well, maybe. But they're also making a 600-mile trip to Provo, dealing with that 4,700-foot elevation. And honestly, after watching their film this season, I'm not sure 2 weeks is enough time to fix what's broken. The weather's actually perfect. 57 degrees at kickoff, light winds, basically no precipitation, so we can throw out any weather equalizers. This comes down to pure matchup. Here's my concern with Stanford. BYU's defense just allowed 51 total yards. 51! That's the second fewest in school history. Yeah, it was Portland State, but you still have to execute at that level. And when you're averaging -2 rushing yards and a half like Portland State was, that tells me BYU's front 7 is legit. The special teams angle is interesting too. BYU had a 54-yard block field goal return for 6, and their kicker nailed a 56-yarder to tie the school record. In what could be a lower-scoring affair than that 69-point explosion suggests, special teams might be the difference. Stanford's got the talent. They always do. But talent on paper versus a team that just played with this kind of precision and depth, BYU showed they can rotate bodies, keep guys fresh, and maintain that intensity throughout. That depth becomes crucial at elevation against a team that just traveled cross-country. The power rankings have BYU as a dominant team right now, and their home field advantage is worth nearly 3 points. Add in the elevation factor, the travel for Stanford, and the momentum from that historic defensive performance. I think BYU covers whatever number they put out there, and I lean under if the total's inflated from that 69-point showing. This feels like BYU wins comfortably, but maybe doesn't need to run up the score against the Pac-12 opponent.